I still wake up with the taste of iron in my mouth, not because of blood, not directly, but like a coin pressed against my tongue, cold, metallic, impossible to ignore. If you want the truth, start from the night I found the poster. That's where everything began to tilt. I was hunting for cheap frames at a pawn shop 2 blocks from my apartment, the kind of place that smells like old paper and oil and a dozen lives folded into objects. It sat behind a stack of yellowed movie flyers, a face half swallowed by shadow, every feature softened by grain, but the eyes were wrong. Where eyes should have been, there were other mouths. Tiny rows of teeth dug into eyelids, lips peeling back like curtains. A big mouth took up the lower face, slack and full of teeth. The title read, "The Disease of the 100 Mouths," in a blocky maroon serif, but the words didn't register at first. My throat tightened, and I could only look at the grin that wasn't quite a grin. I bought it because I wanted something to pin above my bed, some piece of art that looked as though it had lived through its own nightmares. I told myself it was theatrical, a clever design. I told my coworkers I liked vintage horror aesthetics. I told myself everything I needed to sleep. At home, the poster hung to the left of my window. Nights in the city collect their own sounds. Distant trains, a dog that screams like a human, the hollow clatter of a neighbor returning late. But for the first few evenings, there was a new layer. A soft, repetitive rustling, like paper being fanned, as if someone were paging through nothing. I thought the building settled, or a raccoon on the fire escape. I thought the sound belonged outside of me. Then came the first dream. I was standing in a corridor lined with doors, and each time I passed one, the mouth on the poster opened wider until it swallowed the light. I woke with my hands numb and the same metallic tang in my mouth. When the coffee failed to chase away that taste, I checked my gums and my tongue. Nothing. Just a smear of something under my fingernail like dried tobacco. Small things started misbehaving. My phone alarms would hiss a second time with no reason. A voicemail would record only breath. The poster seemed to drop its shadow differently every hour, and sometimes, in the corner of my vision, in the brief half-second before I turned my head, the lower mouth would seem to pulse, like a living thing deciding whether to close. I told myself it was anxiety. I wrote it down. Stress, long hours, the city. But then the neighbor knocked on my door at 3 in the morning and left a note. "Have you heard them?" It was anonymous, the paper jagged at the edges. I stared at the words until the letters blurred, and behind me, the poster's mouths watched me with a patience that felt like appetite. After the note, the apartment stopped feeling like mine. The sounds multiplied and crowed over each other. Not outside anymore, but behind walls, inside vents, braided into the hum of my refrigerator. The rustling grew articulate, as if pages were being turned with caution, like a reader who feared waking whatever slept between the lines. Sleep became a narrow cave I kept returning to with the same trembling hope that this time the cave would be silent. It never was. People stopped believing me. That was the cruel turn. When I tried to tell my coworkers about the poster, their faces folded into polite concern and then closed, like shutters. "You need a break," Sarah said, handing me a coupon for a massage. I smiled and slid the paper into my pocket, the coupon's glossy surface whispering against my thigh with a sound that could have been teeth. Friends canceled plans with flimsy excuses. Their messages arrived late or with words missing, as if someone had bit through the language. I began to recognize a pattern in the omissions. Letters that repeated the word mouth were the ones that went missing. I tried to destroy it. That night, I unpinned the poster, carried it to the bathtub, and set the water to scorch. Steam fogged the glass, and the maroon letters bled into the porcelain like bruises. I watched the paper wrinkle into itself, and then, as slowly as a tide, the water dulled and the poster sat on the porcelain, intact. The sound of the tub draining was a long, dental exhale. I took a hammer to it, 3-4 blows that sang through my knuckles, and when I stepped back, the image was whole again. Only now the mouths on the face seemed to gape a little wider, as if my strikes had been a taste. The next morning, I woke with the impression of talking in my throat. My jaw ached in a way that felt like someone had moved its hinges while I slept. I tasted salt and something chalky like old plaster. On the subway, a woman 2 seats down smiled with a mouth that wasn't hers. her teeth arranged in a looping row that shouldn't have existed. I told myself it was an effect of light or a trick of sleep, but the stranger's eyes were normal, and my reflection in the window behind her showed nothing but my own tired face, and the poster's title reflected faintly, herd-like, across the glass. Voices began to find me in other ways. My voicemail returned once with static, and then, threaded through the hiss, a whisper that sounded like my mother and my ex, and a boy I'd passed in high school, all speaking at once. They said my name, and then a phrase I could not place, an old nursery rhyme maybe, or a marketing jingle. And when I rewound the file, the waveform showed 7 identical peaks where there had been only one. I played it for a friend over the phone. On his end, the line was clean. On mine, the whisper burrowed like a bug. I stopped leaving my apartment. The city became a rumor I could no longer trust. Packages arrived with their seals undisturbed, and inside there were things that did not belong. A school photograph of me from kindergarten with my mouth cropped into a hole. A paper mask shaped like a smile, with dozens of smaller smiles printed along its lip. Each object was anonymous and precise, as if a stranger had gone through the particular drawers of my life and left breadcrumbs made of teeth. One evening, alone and thin with lack of sleep, I watched the poster under the light of my kitchen lamp. The texture of the paper was like skin now. The printed ink seemed to breathe. I spoke aloud, ridiculous as it was, asking it what it wanted. The room answered with a silence so full it had weight. I felt it press the back of my teeth inward. And then, from the poster, a single sound emerged. Not a word so much as the scraping of a throat. It was an attempted syllable that stalled and rewound, like language being practiced. The twist arrived like a bruise. I woke to find my pillow wet with drool. For the first time, there was not merely the taste of metal in my mouth, but a small, stubborn toothache in the upper right. When I ran my tongue along the roof of my mouth, something snagged, an edge, as if another seam of skin had been sutured there. I caught my reflection, and for a ridiculous moment convinced myself it was a trick of light. Then I saw it. A tiny, thin mouth, smaller than a coin but fully formed, right beside my molar, opening and closing in time with my breath. It made a small, wet sound like someone clearing a throat. Panic unspooled into a plan. I cataloged the nights, recorded the sounds, took pictures, and videotaped the poster and myself. Each file, when I played it back, misaligned. The audio would be 3 seconds ahead of the video, or the images would show my hand where my face had been, or the poster would be present in every frame except when I blinked. In the footage, the small mouth on my gums flickered, now there, now gone. And when it appeared, it mouthed syllables I could not identify. By the time the lights failed one stormy Tuesday, I no longer believed I owned a body that was solely mine. I kept the lamp on, watching shadows pool, counting the intervals between the poster's rustles and the new mouth's clicks. They were synchronized with a geometry I could not parse. And then, in the steady dark, I heard from inside my skull, not my ears, the sound of the small teeth sliding together, like a chorus tuning before a concert. They were mapping me with sound, cataloging what I feared. I realized with a fractured clarity that the mouths were not content to remain pictures or whispers. They were patient. They had waited for permission, or for hunger, or for the moment when I would stop looking away. I did not know which I had offered. I can mark the exact hour the apartment stopped belonging to me, the moment the power went out and the poster's shadow unzipped into the room. The storm had been a ragged thing, wind like a thumb scraping a bottle, rain lashing the windows in frantic, blind fingers. When the lights died, the city fell into a hush so complete it made my lungs loud. I should have left then. I did not. There is an economy to fear, a way of counting costs, and mine told me that crossing the threshold would mean exposing whatever had attached itself to me. So I stayed, a man planted in the center of his own eroding certainty, and watched. When light abandons a room, you notice the small sounds that were always there but never mattered. The whisper of fabric, the insect sigh through the sill, the poster's paper flexing like a living membrane. In the dark, the mouths multiplied in my mind until I could hear their arrangement as if I could read Braille across the walls. Soft lips, then hard enamel, then a wet suction like a hand taking a mouthful of something you can't name. My own breath sounded foreign. It came back as if through a tunnel, hollowed and slow. I thought of leaving a window open for air, but the thought of something slipping in with the wind held me like a hand on my skin. Instead, I lit the candle I kept in the kitchen for power outages, a small, useless flame, and set it on the counter between me and the poster. The flame threw the image into a terrible relief. Each row of teeth seemed to catch light differently. The uppermost mouths shimmered with a film that was not quite saliva, not quite varnish. The big lower mouth, the one that had first made me buy the poster as absurd art, moved its jaw in a slow, deliberate chew, as if testing the distance between its teeth and something invisible. My recordings hummed on the table, devices that had betrayed me with their misalignments and their borrowed voices. I played them one after another until the tape of my life became a collage of echoes. In the third hour of the blackout, as the candle guttered, the files synchronized for the first time. Audio and image snapped like two halves of a shell finding each other. The poster's lips moved with the sound that my other mouths had been producing, that corrugated, practiced syllable, and the waveform on the laptop matched the opening and closing of the mouths on my gums. It was an ugly, ecstatic coherence. The small mouth beside my molar elongated like a tongue and formed a consonant I could feel rattling against the back of my teeth. I screamed, a raw animal sound that felt like it had been stored in my rib cage and released all at once. It did not startle the mouths. It fed them. Across the room, the poster's teeth clicked in a rhythm that matched the pattern of knocks I had been hearing in the walls for weeks. The house answered in a chorus. Vents sighed a consonant, pipes coughed another, and somewhere in the corridor outside someone, or something, clapped its hands once, a sound like two slabs of paper meeting. The noise was not outside. It traveled through the building and into my bones. I took the poster down again, not with fumbling anger, but with an urgency that felt surgical. As if following a map I had not noticed until that night, I placed it face down on the kitchen floor, the maroon letters peering at the tiles like an accusation. My hands shook with cold and something else, a small, hungry anticipation that pricked at my scalp. I pressed my palms flat to the poster's back and tried absurdly to feel if the paper had a pulse. It did. Through the paper, I felt the vibrations of hundreds of small movements, the same geometry I had heard, a cataloging, a counting. They wanted an opening. They wanted me to grant them a cavity large enough for a chorus. I thought of teeth as thresholds, of mouths as rooms where voices moved and nested. Panic folded into an obscene practicality. I fetched the box of kitchen knives and set them in a line on the counter. I wanted to excise the small mouth from my gum, to cut it away like a cancer. The logic was simple and wrong, that if one mouth was removed, the hunger might dissipate. It was the sort of thinking people arrive at when they are both lucid and mad. As I stood there, with a blade trembling between my fingers, the small mouth began to speak. Not with words yet, only with an arrangement of clicks and sibilants that translated into a pressure on my teeth. Each sound felt like a key probing a lock. I held the edge of the knife over the place in my mouth where the tiny mouth lived, and for a moment the world reduced to the temperature of the metal and the dull ache of my pulse. The poster's large mouth widened. The rows of smaller mouths around its eyes trembled with coordinated hunger. Then something else happened. A voice I recognized, not from any recording, but from a personal archive. My sister's whisper. The cadence of my father saying my childhood nickname, a lover's laugh from a year ago, threaded through the clicks. They had learned to imitate memory, to wear voices like masks. They used them to lull and to buy time. I realized with a sick clarity that the mouths were not just mouths. They were instruments practiced at mimicry, trained over ages to reproduce the exact timbre that would make a person hesitate. I lowered the knife. If I could not cut them out, perhaps I could bargain with them. I spoke aloud, voice small in the lit kitchen. "What do you want?" I asked. The silence was immediate and vast, a presence that felt like a negative space I could not fill. Then the small mouth in my gum made its tiny wet noise, and the poster's big mouth answered with a tide of sound, not speech but intention. Inside my skull, the chorus arranged itself into cadence, into an almost word. It tasted like something I had once known but had no name for. Permission, it seemed, was what they had waited for. Not because they needed authorization in any human sense, but because hunger that crosses the barrier between image and flesh requires complicity. My days of looking away, of thinking it was a joke or an anxiety, had paved a corridor for their arrival. They had mapped my silences, practiced behind them, and now they needed me to stop fighting long enough for them to take residence. That was the terrible bargain. Silence in exchange for an expansion. I pressed my hand to my mouth, feeling the small lips move like a moth trapped under skin. My jaw unfroze with the effort to not move, to not give them the gap they wanted. The house leaned in, patient as a predator, the building's joints making small harmonic clicks that matched the poster. The candle burned low and blew out, leaving me in a darkness so complete that the mouths were invisible and therefore more present than ever. In the black, the smallest mouth formed a noise that fitted around a human breath. It was not a word yet, only an opening. I felt it at the base of my tongue like a tiny hand. And then, as if from everywhere and nowhere, dozens of tiny voices arranged themselves into a single deliberate syllable. It whispered, "Open."
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.